Migration and adaptation are close to my heart. Technically, I am not an immigrant since since Puerto Rico has been territory, Commonwealth, colony of the United States since 1898. And Puerto Ricanos have been citizens since 1917. However, up until the day I flew into New York at age 12, I lived in a different nation with a different culture, language, religion, traditions, food. Everything was different. In many ways, I related to her father. Each of her stories about family reminded me of mine. After that introduction, I met Lauren at various events around town in our poetry community and have been fortunate to participate in many workshops where she very generously helps us community poets hone our craft. Lauren served as Poet Laureate of New Mexico from 2022 to 2025. She founded the New Mexico Epic Poem Project in partnership with New Mexico Arts to reach remote arts poor areas, encourage residents to explore poetry, and write about their home communities. That, I think, was also one of the kind of topics that Joy Harjo took on to bring Native voices into the poetry community around the country. Lauren is author of 8 books of poetry. The most recent is In Old Sky, which grew out of her experience as astronomer in residence at Grand Canyon National Park. Her books have won many prizes, including the Dorset Prize and the New Mexico Book Award. In 2023, Lauren was honored with the Academy of American Poets Laureate Fellowship. Her poems have been translated into Mandarin, Turkish, Spanish, French, and Arabic. She will speak with us today on poetry and geography, mapping emotions and experience through lines and stanzas. I am proud and happy to introduce Lauren Camp into our humanist community, excuse me, and welcome her here today.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much.
What a beautiful music. That's for you.
Thank you, Sylvia. I didn't know that it was the conversation on women's focus. Interesting. Good morning, everyone. It's delightful to be here. I was last in this room, only once in this room, for a panel for the Chichara Poetry Slam Festival. Not quite sure I have all those words in the right order. And it was a beautiful panel. I don't know if anyone was here for that. Yes, okay. Have you ever been able to see everything? William Faulkner wrote, "Literature has the same impact as a match lit in the middle of a field in the middle of the night. The match illuminates relatively little, but it enables us to see how much darkness surrounds it." For me, poetry gives me a chance to notice not everything, but something, and not necessarily visually, but maybe orally or texturally or through some other sense. It gives me the ability to pay attention to something specific, whatever I want, and whatever catches me. And I might be in the same place as each of you, and you might each see or feel or hear or understand or be curious about something entirely different. And that really appeals to me. That poetry is not one for all. We all have the same experience. So as Sylvia said, my talk, very casual talk, is the theme is poetry and geography, mapping emotions and experience through lines and stanzas. So I think what I'd like to do is start with my very first book and a little maybe a little bit of a story of how this book came to be. I came to New Mexico in 1994. I got married the year after. I arrived with no job, with a person I loved, and no job and no house, and parents who were quite worried about this plan that I had. Together we purchased a small house. Keep in mind, I had no job. We purchased a little house on the outskirts of Santa Fe County. One-bedroom house. We still live in it. And we got jobs. We got lots of jobs. And we were freelance writers for a long time. I came to New Mexico from a career first in public relations and then working for a magazine. And so writing articles, editing. Pretty quickly after I got to New Mexico, I started making visual art, which I did for a good long time. I was deeply devoted to that and immersed in that. At some point along the way, I wrote these things that went along with the visual art for exhibits as the work traveled. And somebody came up to me at an exhibit at a solo show in Kentucky and said, "I know you made the artwork. Who wrote the poems?" And I said, looked around this big room with all my artwork that I had worked on for 10 years. And I said, "There are no poems here." What are you talking about? And the woman took me from piece to piece and pointed to the text, the wall text beside the artwork and said, "This is a poem," and took me to the next piece and said, "This is a poem." And I said, so my medium was fabric and thread, and those wall text things in that medium were called blurbs. And I said, "Oh no, those are blurbs." She said, "Oh no, those are poems." So that was my sort of entry into poetry. Like, okay, if these are poems, let me learn more about what poetry can be, because I thought I knew, and I thought it was rhyming, and I thought it was inscrutable, and I thought it was Shakespearean. And maybe it doesn't have to be all of those things. So I began writing more actively, because now I had a term for what I was doing, more communally, I guess. I began writing. And I thought I would start by reading you the oldest poem I have that was published in a book. It is the last poem in my very first book, and it is called Slow. And it's so much about geography, but really specifically about kind of my land, like where my home is, at a very particular time. Slow. Eyes open, legs splayed in the powdery dirt. She likes the cool of it, the dynamic surge of just belonging to a place like this, brown and barren and slow as rust. She digs deeper with her toes and hums. When the sun crests the kitchen window, she catches fragments of light on her thumb and drags her hand across her chin like buttercups. This will be the year the piñons die, the year the tamarisks stretch inches to the core, the year she goes away and then returns to find the worms still multiplying. Maybe there is no final resolution. Yesterday is how it will be again tomorrow. The earth will slowly crust into tenacious particles, stillness cradled inside like a newborn. So I was away when I wrote that poem. I was in Provincetown, Massachusetts, the very tip of Cape Cod, for 2 months for a residency. I had been invited to go to make art, or really to rest, as the organizer told me later, like, why are you working? You're supposed to rest. But instead, I did both. I was making art and I was working on this kind of poetry thing on the side, not knowing exactly what I was doing. And that not knowing has been how I've done everything really in my life, but also how I've done every creative art, and how like it serves me to not know, to not have an exact approach to something, to have to learn it, to have to relearn it, to have to reshape it, and to find out later, oh, this is an actual thing, people do this. But not to be taught a specific way something is to happen, but to hear my own voice, to understand my own color schemes, to understand what I want from the music of my writing or the silence. So I'll read you another poem from this, a couple more poems from this book. Everyone can hear me okay? Okay, good. Yes. Okay. My first year. In 1967, my mother is already my mother in the seedy, boiled metal of Manhattan, below the women's fancy clothing at Macy's Herald Square, where she works and buys her clothes. In 1967, my mother has stopped her cigarettes. The US blasts through operations Latchkey and Cross Tie with tests named bourbon, persimmon, fizz, cerise, and polka. Apt descriptions for my mother's vibrant outfits. And my little wrinkled body stretches out. My father bathes my hot pink flesh in a plastic tub. John and Paul sing Penny Lane. We wander to the park at 4th and Waverly, my mother in coral bell-bottoms and a yellow blouse. Returning home, she sips rosé, satisfied. In 1967, NBC argues the Vietnam War, a frenzy of race riots. My parents, too busy to listen. What they don't hear keeps climbing away. My father watches the first Super Bowl as a married man. Peggy Fleming skates in a formal ice rink dressed in pink, my mother's eyes entranced. My mother buys a charming pea coat for her 5'10" frame. Sex oozes onto streets and down alleys. Neil Armstrong practices landing on the moon. In 1967, everyone drops acid while my father goes to work. From the couch, my parents watch Milton Berle. My mother lands in the city of humor and stays there smiling as the show keeps ending. In 1967, my mother drags my cradle to the TV set. Fred Rogers walks us through the neighborhood, and my mother grits her teeth. Fred teaches make-believe while my mother organizes her pretty clothing. What is happening isn't happening in my house. Any poets in the audience? Yeah. Where do you start a poem? You could start anywhere. You know that? You could start anywhere. So, you know, I could have started that poem with the year. I could have started that poem with how much I remembered my mother disliking Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. You know, you could start anywhere. And ideally, if you are going to start a poem, start it without knowing exactly where you're going. Or start it with knowing exactly where you're going and being willing to take a side path off that destination. to go somewhere else, to learn something else. So I've read from this book a lot of times, and not very recently. So it's kind of exciting to come back to it. But I thought I would read a poem that I have not read in a very long time. It's in 4 parts. It's called How the Sun Opens Us, Even in Winter. Because here we are heading into winter. It is, so as I said, it's in 4 parts. And when I get to the second part, it mentions a little boy of 4. And he's about to turn 30, so well, a long time. How the sun opens us, even in winter. Singed. Walking along the upper tier, I turn a corner and pass above a perfect swelling gleam. 100 sorority girls with long blonde hair. Talking at once, a continuous fierce wave, the sway of their voices stronger and more illuminated than any other sound in my world. I am drifting this day and, lucky, move into the rays of that single shaft of ecstatic light. The elemental pitch of their tongues rising up, blistering and piercing even the floor on which I stand. I abandon any destination, gaze straight down at the sparkling blaze, watch as they move luminous and golden through the cold open room, scattering and radiating light so it glitters and hums in a corona of energy. I love those women then, all of them at once. So yellow they are, so tempting. The pollen of their voices distracting, so intense it steals over the body almost more than I can bear. But I cannot turn away, looking, looking, until my eyes burn. The sun blur. One afternoon, my nephew and I walk the concrete path around his house. He keeps rushing ahead, quickening, his appetite for himself unending. Surprised, the boy of 4, that the sun walks over us and that we always return back to it. He loves the heavy cloud his shadow casts, and I do too. The vague bluster, the dark smear of him on sidewalk, the stretched body of his small form becoming and disappearing again in migrant light. There is too much excitement, and he cannot find enough. We hurry forward to look again, to see how it is done, how light is slurped up by darkness. Sunrise on my birthday. Chilled, I stand inside a shadow, puffed and solitary, and as I want the cold to stop, the snow descends, floating and rippling around in a canopy, then sleeping gently on the ground, turning the outdoors into a platter with a wide, debonair sky. And the sun, a juicy segment of orange, climbs slowly up the nearby mountain, a lustrous, brandy-tinted slice of hope. Cyclamen. After so many frigid days, the cyclamen have begun unscrolling their pink plumes again, each thin plate of soft silk lifting into the light, proud and long-limbed, each blushing petal rising higher, confident as it sweeps the air. Winter is a cycle of damnation and beauty. 100 days to stumble and hide. My body leans into the fringe of warmth and lingers, asks for nothing more. Even the darkest months make sense, the steady flaring of empty days. even these I am learning to embrace. I think of poetry as a real feast for the senses, offering a way to bring the past toward the present and to see the whole world from the perspective of the unknown. And going back to some of these poems from a long time ago now. They were in a book that came out in 2010, but they had been worked on for, maybe 8 or more years before then. Seeing some of them now and the lessons they had for this me then it's really appealing. Like, to read that line about the darkness and then to realize I spent a month studying the darkness very avidly. It's just interesting it's like looking back at old journals, but in a different way. And that's the thing. When I was a kid, I'm not a diary keeper. I'm not a journal keeper. I'm not a let's make notes every day, or I have a practice where I am not that person who does the practice every day. I write when I have something to write. I revise as often as I can, which would be every day, every other hour if I could. But I don't just sit down and write just to fill a page. I never liked diaries, personally. I could not come up with something interesting to say until I was going to say until I discovered poetry, which is still true, but until I discovered the thing I was doing that I didn't know was called poetry. Because then I could take those words and shape them in some way and make them into some kind of art, some kind of thing that had sound and varying time periods and perspectives and questions and understandings. And then my days and my life and the ordinary whatever I was going through made sense because I could take it and create something out of it. So everyone okay with hearing more poems? Okay. Okay. So I'm going to jump ahead a good ways now to a book that came out in 2023. Sorry. So 13 years later. And also before I'm jumping over whole periods of time and everything. There will be time for questions. So if there are things you want to know that I'm not addressing, I'm happy to answer them. In 2023, I had 2 books come out within 3 or 4 months of each other. Really bad idea, but that's how it worked out. 2 different publishers, and this book that I want to read from is. I think of it as a real love letter to New Mexico. It's, we all know all the amazing things about New Mexico. And certainly I know quite a bit more about varying parts of New Mexico now that I didn't know before, because I've traveled around the state talking to people in communities all over, from, east to west, corner to corner. But also, there are things that are harder. There are things that are challenging about New Mexico. And this is one of them, is wildfires. So the book that I'm reading from is called Worn Smooth Between Devourings. That's what it looks like. I wrote a long poem about wildfires that's in the book. And then there were still fires burning all over. And it didn't feel like I could get away from that. If I'm writing about what's going on and there are fires burning and I'm obsessed with that, how do I then move forward and do anything else? And so I ended up creating this poem, which is very much a crowdsourced poem. It's a poem of other people's words to deal with what we were experiencing collectively. The poem is called Days of the Fire of Fires. We said, here too. We said, no power. We said, oh no. Said many prisms of pity, conclusion. We said those short and small messages that mean terrible, horrifying. Can't believe it, we said, awful, and thinking of you again and again. We said, wow, and OMG, and nightmare, and we said, have a plan. Said, love, and worried, and hope you're okay. We said, plague, and go, or don't. We said, no clearing of sky, and more than a week. We said, vast mist, the color of rust. We said, as if refusing what can be undone. We said forest and town and erasure and species. Some said we are still okay. We said sunrise and ash. We said same here. Or we said never. She said trying to breathe. The winds rape on in the unfocused light. We said it is. It isn't. He said the full coming down, the coiling around. Unreal. We said ravaged, so very, I'm so sorry and so. Same here, we said, or yes, or no. Tragic, we said. Look at it now. We said this morning, said we are settled much as we can, said our house or the neighbors, everything, everyone. Likely to get worse, we said, we heard. The end of the world. How are you? Pray, we said in a whisper. The valley is heavy. We drove through, could not. So I mentioned that I came to poetry from a career as a visual artist. Visual art taught me so much. I also did that as a self-study. At the same time, well, I guess I should throw this in here. The major project I made while I was making visual art, or the first major project I made, was a series of jazz musicians made of fiber. And I worked on that for, I don't know, like 12 years. The series traveled around the country, and when it first went off on the road and I was missing having that kind of involvement with jazz music and learning about jazz in that way, like in that deep study way, I began to volunteer for KUNM initially. I was taught how to, the only thing I was actually officially taught how to do was how to do radio, which you kind of need some kind of teaching. So I learned at KUNM how to broadcast, and then I ended up with a couple of different shows on KSFR, Santa Fe Public Radio, for 15 years that were mainly jazz, some world music, whatever, honestly, whatever I wanted to put in there. And because I was so interested in poetry, I also, in every single show, read 3 poems by 3 different people that were interesting me that week, that I could blend, not with music behind them, but come out of one track into a poem, into some other music. So I tell you that because art and music, and really blending music, shaping a radio show. So the segues between different tracks, like, whatever, or Miles Davis in the 60s and some Appalachian, fiddle music, and figuring out how to put those two things together so a listener would not be jarred, but then we're in a different space, a different musical space, a different soundscape, a different everything, different cultural space. These were the underpinnings for how I write poetry, and they're still very much there today. So from visual art, composition, color, texture, pattern, negative space, line, shape, probably some other things. From music, sound, silence, kind of a multiplicity of sounds, perhaps. Also from reading the poems aloud, and I've read thousands of other people's poems aloud. I'd like to tell you I've read them all really well, but I haven't. And I think I've read a lot of them really well because I practiced a lot, but it taught me what works for me in a poem structurally. I will say, just as a quick example, poems that have capital letters at the left-hand margin that are not the beginning of a thought, very confusing to read aloud. So, poems that have tabs in the middle or some kind of interesting structure, they might work really well to read aloud, or they might be very complicating. And so I took every lesson from every other form that I worked with and incorporated that into what I understood or what I wanted from my own poems, from my own blank page. So that was a whole big thing, but that's where my poems grow from, is those two other forms that I was so deeply embedded in for so long. So okay, I'm still working on this book. The book is called Worn Smooth Between Devourings, and I don't know. I think we're living in really difficult times. There's plenty to worry about, right? You agree? And I think that's really what this poem is about. It's called, and I don't think I've read it out loud to anybody, it's called White Chalet Birdhouse. Where do you house your worry? At 4 a.m., I'm awake to the surly news kicked up in the dark. I'm alert to the wind that keeps situating. The season I've grown to detest now goes wiry all year, and every hour I am reduced to its lacing. A falcon stands guard, toothing the air from its perch on a dead tree to the east. I have so much work to do on the irrational, brutal future of the world in these murky hours. Work that never is needed or finished. Instead, I begin studying theorems, blink through the language of lemmas and identities, and bother the buttons that break me from such propositions. Maybe math is not where I need to be. I used to be grateful for proof, but now want something less narrow to settle in. Do you worry? I've been going to friends' houses and looking devoted for radiance, sitting at their tables in their barns, running my knees against their rivers and petting their turkeys, checking where they are safe, what is lucky, and what might be broken to sorrow. On the web, I find a site with multi-part birdhouses, rooms to move into. Can I say housing keeps me up? I read of the stabbing in Portland as people were traveling home. Then the bus full of Coptic Christians in Egypt en route to the lodging of their hearts. I cannot sleep through any more slaying. The birdhouses are all white, with shingled pine roof and windows and other little advantages, a porthole, a door. A house is for safety, for nesting, for the songs of comfort. I read and read through the stars, and the balcony of light outside turns beautiful, and the wind is now easy as a spoon and not writhing. And the clock on the wall plans its way forward with equations I'll never understand, with time that will always be indefinite, that might even, when I'm not looking, escape. Sylvia mentioned a book that I don't have up here, though it is out there on the table. In, I don't know, maybe, 14 years ago, I started wanting to write about I started thinking about my father's childhood and wondering why I had no real information on why he and his family came around the world, across many, many, many miles, great distance, to a different language, a different everything. He only told me when they arrived in the United States. He came from Baghdad, and I thought it would be great to write about his childhood. And I thought I would just ask him, he would answer, and I would put it through my poetry filter and write poems about it. But it didn't go anything like that because he didn't answer, ever. He would not answer. And so I ended up kind of moving around the edges, giving up, coming back in, working with what I had to work with, which was food and ritual and language. Even though I didn't understand the language, I understood the sound of the language. His silences, maybe faith and miscellaneous other things. And also the emptiness, the places I did not know. So I ended up writing a whole book about that. But there was this one poem that I can't remember if I wrote it after. I just didn't feel done with the subject. I'm probably still not done with the subject, but it is in this book. And the poem is called To Reach Backward. Back in Arabic, my uncles pitched time to its simple anchor of wounds. I couldn't mine their shifts, the crisp industry of anger, so I tunneled through food, which was plentiful, on white plates that ached from the buttery weight. We were in the basket of another Friday in the suburbs. My grandmother in full apron and arthritic fingers. She heard no compliments, unless you count how well I ate lamb's tongue, which she'd stewed for an hour. The food came as history told her to make it. The food came with its vermilion river of beets. The food, spiced and rich, with its lost location, that food. How long were we still hungry? Each bite, loud noises. Remember how the room hummed, the voices swaying the ceiling. We all understood this was now, our palms moving fast to claim stews, which were bursting out steam. I heard that there has to be a break in here somewhere. Are we there?
That's a good place to stop.
Okay, all right.
Just take a break. Thank you.
Yep.
Our traditional 7.5 time unit, like minutes, break, and come back, and
Okay.
I think you're prepared to answer questions
Uh-huh.
or have a conversation. So,
Yeah.
yeah. The restrooms are